The root cellar smelled of earth and rot and the particular sweetness of preserves going to vinegar in the Alabama heat. Josiah's hands did not shake as he tied the neck of the cotton sack, though his heart hammered against his ribs like something caged and desperate. Inside the sack, the glass had been ground so fine it looked like sugar, like salt, like innocence itself, a powder that caught what little light bled through the cellar's narrow window and threw it back in tiny, glittering promises. Above him, the floorboards creaked. Josiah froze, his breath caught somewhere between his throat and his stomach. The creak came again, a footstep, deliberate and heavy. Master Cornelius's gait, or perhaps the overseer Thaddeus Burke making his rounds before the guests arrived. Either man would have questions if they found the house butler standing in the cellar at dusk, clutching a sack he had no business holding. He had perhaps 3 minutes. Maybe less. The powder had taken him 2 weeks to prepare, grinding bottle glass stolen piece by piece from the trash heap behind the kitchen house. Green glass from wine bottles, clear glass from medicine vials, all of it pulverized between 2 stones in the dead hours before dawn when even the overseers slept off their whiskey. The sound had been terrible, a shrieking grind that he was certain would wake the entire plantation. But no one came. No one ever came when it mattered. Josiah moved with the practiced silence of a man who had spent 43 years making himself invisible. He tucked the sack inside his coat, feeling the weight of it against his chest like a second heartbeat, and slipped between the shelves of preserves toward the cellar stairs. Above, the footsteps moved away, toward the front of the house where the carriages would soon arrive. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Master Cornelius made his decision, and 3 days since Josiah made his. The memory came to him unbidden as he climbed the cellar stairs, each step a journey through time. 3 mornings past, Josiah had been summoned to the front parlor. That alone was unusual. He was not typically called before his master except to receive instructions for dinner service or household management. He had stood in the doorway, his face arranged in the expression of pleasant attentiveness that white folks expected, while Cornelius Merricks sat in his leather chair like a king on a throne. "Josiah," the master had said, not looking up from his ledger. "I've made a sale." The words meant nothing at first. Sales were common: cotton, timber, livestock. Then Cornelius looked up, and Josiah saw something in those pale blue eyes that made his blood turn to ice water. "Your girl. Delilah. Fellow from Mobile is willing to pay top dollar. She's young yet, strong, good teeth. I've agreed to the terms." The world had tilted then, gone sideways and strange. Josiah heard his own voice from very far away. "Sir, Delilah is a house girl. She serves the mistress well. Surely. Don't presume to tell me my business, boy." Cornelius set down his pen with exaggerated care. "This is about your insolence last week. Telling my wife that the roast was overdone before she had a chance to taste it herself. Making me look the fool at my own table." "Master, I only meant." "I don't care what you meant. You need to remember your place, Josiah. And since words don't seem to penetrate that thick skull of yours, perhaps this will serve as an adequate reminder. Delilah was 22 years old. She had her mother's eyes, her mother, whom Josiah had loved and lost to fever when Delilah was just a child. She sang while she worked, hymns and field songs mixed together into something that sounded like hope. She was the only good thing Josiah had left in this world. "Please," Josiah had said, and hated himself for the begging in his voice. "Please, sir. I'll do anything. Take the lash, take my rations, but please." Cornelius smiled then. It was not a kind smile. "Oh, you'll watch, Josiah. You'll watch her go, and you'll remember this feeling every time you think about stepping out of line again." And Josiah had watched. 2 days later, he had stood in the yard with his hands clenched behind his back while a horse trader from Mobile examined Delilah like livestock, checking her teeth, her eyes, making her walk back and forth. She had looked at Josiah once, just once, and in her eyes he saw not accusation but something worse, resignation. The knowledge that this was always how it was going to end. They put her in the wagon at noon. By evening, she was gone, swallowed by the road that led south toward Mobile, and God knew what kind of hell awaited her there. That night, Josiah had gone to the trash heap and selected the first bottle. He ground it to powder and felt nothing at all, no rage, no grief, just a vast and terrible clarity. The kitchen house stood separate from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that was supposed to prevent fires from spreading but mostly just let the heat and mosquitoes in. Josiah slipped inside, grateful for the chaos. Harriet, the head cook, stood over a pot of butter beans, sweat streaming down her dark face. Two younger girls, Ruth and Esther, plucked chickens by the door, feathers drifting like snow. Harriet caught his eye and gave the smallest of nods. She knew. He had told her 2 nights ago, sitting in her cabin after midnight, and she had listened without judgment and then said, "I'll help you." Now she stirred her beans and said, loud enough for the girls to hear, "Josiah, the sugar's running low. Master wants extra for the tea tonight. Best refill that tin from the stores." "Yes'm," Josiah said, playing his part. The sugar tin sat on the high shelf, white porcelain with blue flowers painted around the rim. Josiah took it down with steady hands. In the confusion of dinner preparation, no one watched as he stepped into the pantry. No one saw him empty the cotton sack into the tin, mixing the ground glass with the remaining sugar until it was invisible, indistinguishable. He stood there for a moment, the tin in his hands, and thought of Delilah's face as the wagon pulled away. He thought of his mother, dead of fever that could have been treated if the doctor had been willing to see her. He thought of his father, whom he barely remembered, sold south when Josiah was 5 years old. He thought of Marcus, whipped to death last summer for talking back. Of Sarah, who drowned herself in the creek after the master's son finished with her. Of Moses in the fields, back scarred into topographical maps of pain. Of every indignity, every cruelty, every casual evil that had been the weather of his entire life. The tin felt light in his hands. Impossibly light for what it represented. Through the kitchen window, he heard the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. The guests were arriving. Josiah set the sugar tin back on the shelf, smoothed his coat, and straightened his spine. When he walked out of the pantry, his face showed nothing but the pleasant, empty expression of the perfect servant. "I'll take the aperitifs out to the veranda," he said to Harriet. She looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw understanding and fear and something like terrible hope. "Walk careful, Josiah," she said quietly. He nodded once, then lifted the silver tray and headed toward the main house, toward the sound of white laughter drifting through the evening air, toward the moment he had spent 2 weeks preparing for. The sun was setting over the cotton fields, turning the sky the color of blood and fire. Cicadas screamed in the oak trees. Spanish moss hung from the branches like the remnants of funeral shrouds, swaying in the hot breeze that offered no relief. Inside the house, Master Cornelius Merricks stood in his finest coat, greeting guests with a wide smile and firm handshakes, utterly unaware that his butler had just sentenced him to death. Josiah moved like a shadow through the gathering, offering drinks, murmuring pleasantries, invisible and patient and absolutely resolved. The glass was ready. The guests were arriving. And the long night was only beginning. If you're drawn into this dark tale of vengeance and survival, subscribe to join us for more macabre horror stories from forgotten American history. Drop a comment below telling us what you think drove him to this point. The veranda wrapped around the front of the Merricks plantation house like a white-painted promise, all Greek revival columns and pretension. Josiah emerged from the dim interior into the thick golden light of an Alabama evening, the silver tray balanced perfectly in his hands. On it, crystal glasses filled with peach brandy caught the dying sun and threw amber shadows across the painted floorboards. Colonel Beauregard Ashford arrived first, as he always did, a man who treated punctuality as a form of dominance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard trimmed to sharp precision, his uniform from the Mexican War still fitting despite 20 years and considerable bourbon. His wife, Temperance, followed 3 steps behind as was proper, her face powdered to obscurity beneath a hat heavy with silk flowers that were already wilting in the heat. "Cornelius." The colonel's voice carried across the lawn like artillery fire. "Damn fine evening for a supper." "Damn fine." Josiah descended the veranda steps with his tray, his feet finding the rhythm that had been beaten into him over decades, smooth, silent, subservient. He offered the brandy with a small bow, his eyes properly lowered. "Colonel." "Mrs. Ashford." The colonel took his glass without acknowledgement. Josiah might as well have been a piece of furniture that happened to serve drinks. But Temperance's hand trembled slightly as she reached for hers, and Josiah caught the yellow-purple shadow of a bruise beneath the powder on her jaw. He felt a flicker of something almost like pity, then remembered that Temperance Ashford had personally selected the girl for her husband's bed last winter, a 14-year-old named Clara who screamed for 3 nights until she stopped making sound at all. Pity died as quickly as it had surfaced. "You're looking well, Temperance," said Evangeline Merricks, emerging onto the veranda in a gown of deep green silk that had probably cost more than the combined value of everyone working in the fields. The mistress of the house moved with the languid confidence of a woman who had never questioned her place in the world. "That shade of blue suits you, though perhaps something lighter for the summer months. One must be mindful of the heat." The barb landed softly, wrapped in honeyed concern. Temperance's smile tightened at the corners. Behind them, more carriages rolled up the oak-lined drive, wheels crunching on the oyster-shell path that Cornelius had imported at outrageous expense from the Gulf Coast. Josiah returned to his post by the door, refilled his tray, and prepared to greet the next wave of guests with the same invisible efficiency. Judge Zebediah Calhoun arrived in a black carriage pulled by matched grays, the horses' coats slick with sweat. The judge was a skeletal man, all angles and sharp edges, his face weathered to leather by years of outdoor sentencing. In Wilcox County, justice was often administered in the public square, and Judge Calhoun believed in the educational value of spectacle. Josiah offered him brandy and watched the man's thin lips purse in appreciation. "Fine vintage, Merricks," the judge called out. "Nothing but the best from you, as always." Josiah's hands remained steady, but his mind flickered back 2 years to a Tuesday morning in summer. A young man named Isaac had been accused of stealing a ham from the smokehouse, a crime he committed because his wife had just given birth and had no milk to nurse with, her own rations having been cut for some imagined slight. Judge Calhoun had sentenced him to 200 lashes, to be administered over 4 days so that the lesson would last longer. Isaac died on the 3rd day. His back had looked like plowed earth, red and glistening. The judge had watched from his bench, making notes in his ledger between strokes. "Josiah." Cornelius's voice cut through the memory like a blade. "Stop hovering and fetch more brandy from the cellar. The widow Thornton has just arrived, and you know she drinks like Sherman marching to the sea." Polite laughter rippled across the veranda. Josiah bowed slightly, not too deep, never too deep, or they would think him mocking, and retreated into the house. But he paused just inside the door, hidden in shadow, and watched through the window as the widow Abigail Thornton made her entrance. She was 60 if she was a day, dressed in mourning black despite her husband having been dead for a decade. Her face had the pinched quality of someone who had spent a lifetime sucking on lemons and finding them not quite sour enough. She walked with a cane, though Josiah knew for a fact that she had no need of it. The cane was mahogany with a silver handle, and she used it to strike servants who displeased her. Last year, a girl named Penny had spilled water on the widow's skirts during a visit. The old woman had beaten her across the face with that cane until the girl's left eye swelled shut and never opened right again. Penny still worked in the Thornton house, half-blind and terrified. "Abigail." Evangeline swept forward with practiced grace. "How wonderful of you to come. You simply must tell me about the new drapes you've had installed. I've heard they're magnificent." "French silk," the widow said, her voice like gravel scraped across tin. "Cost a fortune to ship, but one must maintain standards. Though I fear standards are slipping everywhere one looks these days. Why, just last week I had to dismiss a girl for laziness. The young ones have no work ethic anymore, Evangeline. None at all. Dismissed. The word was a pleasant euphemism. Josiah knew what it really meant: sold, likely to the deep south where the cotton field stretched to the horizon and life expectancy was measured in seasons rather than years. He turned away from the window and descended once more into the cellar, but this time he felt no anxiety, no fear. The first stage was complete. The guests were arriving, their glasses in hand, their appetites whetted. Soon they would move to the dining room. Soon the real supper would begin. When Josiah returned with fresh brandy, the veranda had filled completely. The evening light had deepened to purple, and the first fireflies were beginning to pulse in the magnolia trees. Lanterns had been lit, casting everything in a warm glow that made the assembled company look almost human. The final guests were the Pembertons, Nathaniel and Constance, married only 3 months and still carrying that nauseating sheen of young love. Nathaniel was the son of a Charleston shipping magnate, sent to Alabama to manage his family's new cotton investments. Constance was 17, blonde, and perpetually startled, like a deer that had wandered into a room full of wolves and didn't yet understand what it was seeing. Josiah might have felt sorry for her, except that she had already proven herself an apt pupil of cruelty. 2 weeks ago, he had overheard her in the morning room, laughing with Evangeline about a house girl who had been caught trying to learn her letters. "Can you imagine?" Constance had said, her voice bright with incredulity. As if they could even understand what they were reading. Nathaniel says their brains simply aren't formed for such things. It's not cruelty to keep them ignorant, it's mercy, really. Like not teaching a dog to read. What would be the point? They had laughed together, 2 women in expensive dresses, drinking tea that Josiah had served them. Now Constance accepted her brandy with a smile that showed too many teeth, and Nathaniel clapped Cornelius on the shoulder with the false camaraderie of young men trying to impress their elders. "Magnificent spread you've prepared," Nathaniel said, gesturing vaguely at the house. "Constance and I are honored to be included." "Nonsense," Cornelius boomed. "You're practically family now, my boy. Anyone investing in Alabama cotton is a friend of the Merricks family." The men launched into talk of yields and prices, of tariffs and shipping routes, their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of commerce. The women clustered near the railing, discussing fashion and scandal in equal measure. Servants, the ones deemed decorative enough for white company, stood at intervals with fans, moving the hot air in lazy circles that provided no relief. Josiah moved among them all, refilling glasses, removing empties, his presence noted only when they wanted something. He was a piece of the architecture, no more remarkable than the columns or the floorboards. But he saw everything. He saw Judge Calhoun's hand drift to the young serving girl's waist as she passed, saw her flinch and force herself to stillness. He saw the colonel's eyes tracking another girl across the lawn, calculating and hungry. He saw Evangeline whisper something to the widow Thornton that made them both laugh behind their fans, their eyes cutting toward Temperance Ashford with surgical precision. He saw Cornelius, holding court in the center of it all, a man who had built his wealth on the broken backs of people he considered less than human, who had sold Josiah's daughter away like livestock and thought it a reasonable punishment for imagined disrespect. The rage that had been building in Josiah's chest for 3 days, for 43 years, crystallized into something cold and pure and absolutely certain. Behind the house, smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Harriet would be putting the final touches on the meal, the butter beans simmering, the cornbread cooling, the quail roasting until the skin crisped to golden perfection. And in the pantry, in a white porcelain tin with blue painted flowers, the ground glass waited, patient and invisible, mixed into sugar that would sweeten their tea, glaze their desserts, coat their refined palates with something beautiful and terrible. "Josiah." Cornelius's voice cracked across the veranda like a whip. "Stop daydreaming and announce supper. Our guests are hungry." Josiah set down his tray and straightened his coat. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, the voice of a perfect servant. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would be so kind as to make your way to the dining room. Supper is served." They filed past him in a rustle of silk and linen, trailing perfume and tobacco smoke. The cicadas screamed in the trees. The fireflies pulsed like tiny heartbeats in the gathering dark. And Josiah followed them inside, toward the dining room where the table had been set with the Merricks family silver, toward the meal that would be remembered, if anyone survived to remember it, as the Last Supper of the Alabama cotton aristocracy. The glass was waiting. The guests were hungry. And Josiah had never felt more awake in his entire life. The dining room was a temple to excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, their candles casting shadows that danced across walls papered in deep crimson damask. The table stretched the length of the room, mahogany polished to a mirror shine, set with china so fine you could see candlelight through it. Silver gleamed at every place setting, forks and knives and spoons in descending sizes, each with its specific purpose in the elaborate ritual of wealthy dining. Josiah stood against the wall, hands clasped behind his back, face arranged in pleasant neutrality as the guests took their seats. Cornelius sat at the head of the table, Evangeline at the foot, their dominion stretching between them. The others arranged themselves by rank and social calculation, the colonel to Cornelius's right, Judge Calhoun to his left, the widow Thornton beside Evangeline where she could best dispense her particular brand of acidic commentary. "What a magnificent table, Evangeline," Constance Pemberton breathed, her eyes wide as a child's at Christmas. She sat beside her husband, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "I do hope our own home will be half so grand when we're properly settled." "It takes time, dear," Evangeline said, her smile sharp as cut glass. "And taste, of course. Not everyone has the refinement to know what true elegance looks like." The barb wasn't even aimed at Constance, but the girl blushed anyway, uncertain whether she'd been complimented or insulted. Nathaniel reached over and patted her hand with the condescension of a man explaining the world to a particularly slow child. Josiah caught Harriet's eye as she emerged from the kitchen passage, carrying the first course, a delicate consommé in bone china bowls. Behind her came Ruth and Esther with baskets of cornbread, still steaming, wrapped in linen napkins white as cotton bowls. The soup was safe. Josiah had made certain of that. The glass would come later, distributed across courses, mixed into components that would be consumed by everyone. Not enough in any single dish to cause immediate suspicion, but together, across the meal, enough to shred their insides like their overseer's whips had shredded so many backs. He moved forward to pour wine, a Bordeaux that Cornelius had been saving for a special occasion. The bottle had cost more than Josiah would earn in 5 years, if he were actually paid for his labor rather than compensated with thin rations and the privilege of not being sold. "Excellent vintage," the colonel pronounced after his first sip, swirling the wine in his glass like he was performing surgery. "You always did have an eye for quality, Cornelius. In wine and in property both." Property. The word hung in the air, and Josiah knew exactly what property the colonel meant. Last winter's transaction, Clara, the 14-year-old girl, sold from the Merricks estate to the Ashford plantation. Payment rendered in full. "One must maintain standards," Cornelius said, echoing the widow's earlier sentiment. "The moment you compromise on quality, everything begins to slide toward mediocrity. It's true in wine, in cotton, in livestock, in everything." They were talking about human beings and bottles of wine in the same breath, with the same casual assessment of value. Josiah poured Judge Calhoun's wine and felt the coldness in his chest spread outward, into his arms, his hands, his fingers wrapped around the bottle's neck. The soup course ended. Josiah and Harriet cleared the bowls with synchronized efficiency, a dance they'd perfected over years of service. In the kitchen passage, out of sight, Harriet caught his wrist. "The butter," she whispered. "It's ready." Josiah nodded once. The butter sat in a crystal dish, golden and innocent, mixed with herbs from the garden and something else, something that glittered faintly if you knew to look for it, ground fine enough to pass as salt crystals or tricks of the light. The second course emerged, roasted quail, arranged on platters with artistic precision. The birds glistened with glaze, their tiny legs crossed delicately, surrounded by roasted vegetables that had been grown in the same fields where people were worked to death. Beside each platter, the butter dishes, ready to be spread across the warm cornbread that would accompany the meat. Magnificent, Judge Calhoun declared, reaching immediately for the butter. His knife scraped across the dish, gathering a generous portion. "Your cook outdoes herself, Evangeline." "Harriet is a treasure," Evangeline agreed. "Though she's getting on in years. I've been considering selling her south and bringing in someone younger, more energetic." In the corner, Harriet's hand tightened on the serving platter, but her face showed nothing. Josiah felt something crack inside his chest, not his resolve, but the last thin membrane that had separated him from action. These people spoke of Harriet, who had helped raise Evangeline from a child, who had nursed her through fevers and taught her to love cornbread with honey, as if she were a piece of worn furniture to be discarded. He watched them butter their bread. Watched them bite into the warm cornbread, the butter melting on their tongues. Watched them chew and swallow and reach for more. The quail was consumed with enthusiasm, bones picked clean by fingers that had never known manual labor. Conversation flowed like the wine. Josiah kept pouring, talk of cotton prices and political maneuvering, of which families were rising and which were falling, of the essential rightness of their world and their place at its apex. "I heard there was trouble down in Montgomery," Nathaniel Pemberton said, trying to contribute to the conversation like a student reciting lessons. "Some abolitionist literature being distributed. Dangerous ideas taking root." "Nothing that can't be handled with a firm hand," the colonel said dismissively. "These northern agitators don't understand that we're doing God's work here. Bringing civilization to a savage people, structure to chaos. Without us, they'd still be running wild in Africa." Agreement rippled around the table. Constance nodded along, her blonde curls bobbing. The widow Thornton lifted her wine glass in a small, approving gesture. Josiah stood against the wall and felt something like wonder at their absolute certainty. They truly believed it, that the architecture of cruelty they'd built was ordained by God, that their comfort was natural law, that the people they owned were less than human and should be grateful for the yoke. The third course arrived, butter beans cooked with fatback, collard greens wilted in pot liquor, sweet potatoes candied with molasses. And at the center of the table, a fresh basket of cornbread, this batch glazed with butter and something else, honey from the plantation's own hives, mixed that afternoon with ground glass so fine it might have been pollen. "You must try the honey butter," Evangeline urged Constance. "It's a Merricks family specialty." The girl reached for it eagerly, spreading it thick across her bread. Beside her, Nathaniel did the same. Around the table, hands reached and knives spread and mouths consumed. Josiah poured more wine. His movements were mechanical now, automatic. He existed in a strange state between absolute presence and total detachment, watching himself serve poison to people who couldn't imagine that the furniture had feelings, had desires, had a daughter sold away 3 days ago. Then it happened. Constance reached for the butter dish, not to spread more, but to examine it. She lifted it slightly, tilting it toward the candlelight, her young face puzzled. "How strange," she said, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation. "There's something glittering in the butter. Like little crystals." Time stopped. Every muscle in Josiah's body tensed. Across the room, Harriet went rigid. The guests turned their attention to Constance, to the butter dish she held suspended in the candlelight, where indeed, if you looked closely, you could see tiny fragments catching the light, throwing it back in miniature stars. Josiah moved. "My apologies, Mrs. Pemberton," he said smoothly, crossing to her side. "That batch must have gotten some salt crystals that didn't fully dissolve. Please, allow me to replace it with a fresh dish." He took the butter from her hands before she could protest, before anyone could look too closely, before Cornelius could rise from his chair with questions in his eyes. "Honestly, Josiah," Evangeline said with practiced irritation. "You know we serve only perfection at this table. See that it doesn't happen again." "Of course, mistress. My apologies." He retreated to the kitchen passage, heart hammering now, the mask finally cracking. Behind him, conversation resumed, a near miss, transformed into a story about incompetent servants, already forgotten. In the kitchen, Josiah stood over the butter dish, staring at the evidence of his plan, nearly exposed. His hands shook for the first time all evening. Harriet appeared beside him, her face grave. Too much in that batch. The light caught it. They've already eaten enough, Josiah said quietly. In the bread, the glaze. It's done. Then we wait. They prepared the final course together, pecan pie, the pecans harvested by hands that would never taste what they'd gathered. The sugar for the crust had been mixed that morning, half ground glass, half sweetness. The whipped cream was pure, but it hardly mattered now. Josiah carried the dessert plates into the dining room where the guests sat in satisfied fullness, their bellies round with food and death. Ah, dessert, Cornelius sighed contentedly. The perfect end to a perfect meal. They ate. They praised. They consumed their futures without knowing it. And Josiah stood against the wall, hands clasped, face empty, and waited for the glass to do its work. Outside, full dark had fallen. In the fields, the enslaved people were returning to their cabins, their day's labor complete. In the cotton gin, Moses was preparing for something else entirely, a different kind of work, the kind that would burn rather than build. The guests finished their pie. Cornelius suggested they retire to the parlor for brandy and cigars. They rose from the table, sated and unsuspecting, and walked toward their deaths on full stomachs. This story only gets darker from here. If you're brave enough to continue, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, would you have done the same in his position? The parlor was thick with cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. Leather chairs arranged in a half-circle faced the fireplace, though no fire burned in the August heat, only candles in the ornate mantelpiece, their flames struggling against the humid air that pressed through the open windows like something alive and malevolent. The men had settled into their seats with brandy snifters and Cuban cigars, while the women occupied the settees near the window, fanning themselves and speaking in that particular cadence of polite gossip that concealed knives. Josiah moved between them like a ghost, refilling glasses, emptying ashtrays, his presence acknowledged only by the occasional grunt or raised hand demanding service. An hour had passed since dessert. Then another 30 minutes. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked toward 10. Any moment now. Judge Calhoun was holding forth on the necessity of harsh sentencing as a deterrent to theft and disobedience, his skeletal frame draped across his chair like a praying mantis. The problem with mercy, he was saying, his voice dry as old paper, is that these people mistake it for weakness. Give them an inch and they'll take a mile. Show them the lash, however, show them what happens when they step out of line, and you'll find they're remarkably quick learners. Here, the colonel agreed, tapping ash from his cigar into the crystal tray Josiah held. Discipline is the cornerstone of civilization. Without it, we'd have chaos. Anarchy. Cornelius nodded sagely from his position by the window, one hand resting on his considerable belly. It's not cruelty, it's education. Like training a dog or breaking a horse. They need firm guidance, clear boundaries. It's actually a kindness, when you think about it properly. Josiah's hand remained steady on the brandy decanter. His face remained empty. Inside, he counted heartbeats, measured breaths, waited. Then Judge Calhoun's face changed. It was subtle at first, a tightening around his eyes, a slight grimace that he tried to pass off as thoughtfulness. His hand moved to his stomach, pressed there, released. He shifted in his chair, crossed and uncrossed his legs. Forgive me, he said, his voice carrying the faintest edge of discomfort. I seem to have indulged too heavily. Rich food never did agree with me after dark. Getting old, Zebediah, the colonel laughed. Can't handle your supper like you used to. But 10 minutes later, the judge's face had gone gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the fans that the serving girls waved in lazy circles. His breathing had become shallow, rapid. He set down his brandy with a hand that trembled visibly. I think. He began, then stopped. His throat worked, swallowing convulsively. I think I need some air. He stood, and immediately his knees buckled. The colonel reached out to steady him, but the judge pushed him away, one hand still clutching his stomach. He took 3 steps toward the door before he vomited, a sudden, violent expulsion that splattered across the Persian rug in a spray of partially digested quail and cornbread and something else, something dark and wrong. Blood. The room went silent except for the judge's gasping breaths and the steady tick of the clock. My God, Temperance Ashford whispered, her fan frozen in mid-wave. Judge Calhoun dropped to his knees, hands pressed against the rug, and vomited again. More blood this time, bright arterial red mixed with the contents of his stomach. His whole body convulsed with the effort, muscles spasming beneath his formal coat. Get a doctor, Cornelius barked, but he hadn't moved from his position by the window. No one had moved. They all stood frozen, watching the judge writhe on the floor like something inhuman, like the very thing they'd spent dinner insisting their slaves were. Then the widow Thornton made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like a whimper. Her face had gone the color of old paper. She pressed one hand to her chest, the other to her mouth, and when she took her hand away, blood stained her palm. I don't feel. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her cane clattered to the floor as she doubled over, and the sound that came from her throat was nothing human, a gurgling, drowning sound that spoke of internal injuries, of something fundamentally wrong. What's happening? Constance Pemberton's voice rose to a shriek. She stood in the center of the room, turning in circles like she might find an answer in the furniture, in the wallpaper, in the faces of the other guests. What's wrong with them? Nathaniel Pemberton had gone pale, but he moved to his wife's side, tried to project masculine confidence even as his own hand drifted unconsciously to his stomach. It must be the food, he said. Something gone bad in the... He stopped. His eyes widened. For a moment he stood perfectly still, and Josiah could see the exact instant when he felt it, the first slice of glass working through his intestinal wall, the beginning of internal bleeding that would not stop. Oh no, Nathaniel whispered. Oh God, no. Across the room, Colonel Ashford lurched to his feet, his face purple with rage or pain or both. Cornelius. What kind of meal have you served us? I feel like my guts are, he broke off, bent double, and when he straightened, blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Like they're being carved from the inside. That's when Evangeline Merricks began to scream. She had been sitting on the settee, still composed, still trying to maintain the fiction of control even as her guests collapsed around her. But now her hands clutched her stomach and her mouth opened and the sound that came out was primal, terrified, the sound of someone realizing that death had been invited to dinner and had accepted the invitation enthusiastically. The parlor descended into chaos. Judge Calhoun had stopped moving, his body sprawled across the blood-soaked rug, eyes open and unseeing. The widow Thornton collapsed beside him, her black mourning dress spreading around her like a funeral shroud. Constance Pemberton sobbed in her husband's arms, but Nathaniel himself was sinking to his knees, blood running from his nose, his mouth, his eyes streaming tears of pure agony. The colonel tried to reach the door, stumbled, fell against the wall, and slid down it leaving a red smear. Temperance crawled to him on hands and knees, her elaborate dress dragging through vomit and blood, calling his name in a voice that had lost all its refined pretension. And Cornelius Merricks stood in the center of it all, turning slowly, his face a mask of incomprehension that was beginning to crack into realization and horror. His eyes found Josiah. Josiah stood against the wall where he'd been standing all evening, the brandy decanter still in his hands, his face no longer empty but filled with something cold and vast and absolutely certain. You, Cornelius said, and his voice was barely a whisper. You did this. Josiah said nothing. He simply stood there, letting Cornelius see him, truly see him, for perhaps the first time in 43 years. My God, Cornelius breathed. The food. You poisoned us. You poisoned. He stopped, his hand moving to his own stomach, pressing there as if he could hold himself together through sheer will. How? How did you? Ground glass, Josiah said quietly. His voice was steady, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather or the cotton harvest. In the butter. The honey glaze. The sugar for the tea. Mixed so fine you couldn't taste it, couldn't see it. Just small amounts in each dish, but you ate so much. You always eat so much. Cornelius's face went from confusion to rage to something like betrayal, as if Josiah had violated some sacred trust by refusing to die quietly for the master's convenience. I'll have you hanged, Cornelius snarled, but the effect was ruined when blood bubbled at the corners of his mouth. Drawn and quartered. Burned alive. I'll make an example of you that. You sold my daughter, Josiah said, and his voice cracked for the first time all evening. 3 days ago. You sold Delilah to punish me for speaking truth about your overcooked meat. You made me watch them take her. You smiled while you did it. She was my property. Cornelius roared, though the roar came out as a wet cough. Mine to do with as I, he doubled over suddenly, his face contorting. When he looked up, his teeth were red. You're nothing. You're livestock. I'm a man who had a daughter, Josiah said. And you took her from me like it meant nothing. Like she meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. He set down the brandy decanter with careful precision on the side table. Around them, the guests were dying in various stages of agony. Constance Pemberton had gone silent, slumped against her husband's body. The colonel had stopped breathing. Evangeline lay curled in a fetal position near the fireplace, blood pooling beneath her green silk dress. Cornelius took a step toward Josiah, his hand outstretched like he might still command obedience, still enforce the natural order. But his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees on the rug where he'd stood so many times before, dispensing judgment and cruelty with the casual certainty of a god. This won't change anything, he gasped. They'll kill you for this. They'll kill all of you. The system will. The system, Josiah said, is burning. As if in answer, a sound drifted through the open windows, not quite thunder, but something like it. Distant shouts. The crackle of flames. And beneath it all, a sound that Cornelius Merricks had probably never heard in his entire life, the voices of enslaved people raised not in work songs or spirituals, but in rage. Cornelius's eyes widened. No, he whispered. No, you didn't. I didn't do anything, Josiah said. But I'm not the only one who's been grinding glass, master. We've all been grinding something. Grief. Rage. The memory of every lash, every sail, every child torn from their mother's arms. You thought we were too simple to plan, too docile to resist. You mistook our silence for consent. He walked to the window and looked out at the night. In the distance, flames rose from the direction of the cotton gin, painting the sky orange and red. Silhouettes moved against the firelight, and even from here, Josiah could hear the sounds of systematic destruction, the architecture of slavery coming apart at its seams. Behind him, Cornelius Merricks tried to speak, but all that came out was blood. He fell forward onto the rug, his hand outstretched toward Josiah's boot, and then went still. Josiah stood at the window and felt nothing. No triumph. No guilt. Just a vast emptiness where something had been building for 43 years, now finally released. The clock struck 11. In the parlor of the Merricks plantation house, surrounded by the bodies of Alabama's finest citizens, Josiah straightened his coat, walked to the door, and stepped out into the night where the cotton gin was burning and freedom, brief and terrible and impossibly fragile, waited in the orange glow of flames. The night air hit Josiah's face like a baptism, hot and thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood and cotton and something else, something like liberation distilled into scent. He stood on the veranda where he'd served aperitifs just hours before, and the world had transformed into something unrecognizable, something that looked like the end of everything or possibly the beginning. The cotton gin blazed against the black sky like a pagan altar, flames climbing 60 feet high, sparks rising into the darkness like reverse stars. The building that had processed 200 bales a day, that had generated the wealth that built this house and bought these people, was collapsing in on itself with a groaning roar that sounded almost alive. Almost satisfied. Figures moved in the firelight, not fleeing, not cowering, but purposeful. Methodical. Josiah watched as Moses, the head field hand, emerged from the overseer's cabin carrying an armload of ledgers and account books. He threw them into the flames with a gesture that was almost ceremonial. Behind him came Samuel and Abraham and Isaiah, carrying barrels of molasses that they appended into the fire, feeding it, making it grow. Josiah. Harriet's voice came from behind him. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her kitchen apron, her face streaked with tears and soot and something like terrible joy. Is it done? It's done. She nodded once, then turned back into the house. Josiah heard her moving through the rooms, and moments later she emerged with an armload of silver candlesticks, the Merricks family Bible, a painting of Cornelius's grandfather in his Revolutionary War uniform. She walked down the steps and threw them all into the bushes like they were garbage, which is exactly what they were now, artifacts of a world that was ending tonight, whether it survived past dawn or not. More people emerged from the quarters, men, women, children who shouldn't be awake at this hour but were awake anyway, drawn by the flames and the sounds and the electric feeling in the air that something fundamental had shifted. Old Jacob, who'd been on the Merricks plantation longer than anyone, stood with his hands raised to the burning gin like he was warming them at a hearth. Tears ran down his scarred face. 47 years, he said to no one in particular. 47 years I worked that gin. 47 years. Beside him, a young woman named Ruth, one of the kitchen girls, began to sing. Not a work song, not a spiritual, but something else, something that sounded like the beginning of a hymn and the end of the world harmonized together. Other voices joined hers, building into a chorus that rose above the crackle of flames. Josiah descended the veranda steps and walked toward the fire. Moses saw him coming and moved to meet him halfway, the two men stopping within arm's reach, the firelight painting their faces in dancing shadows. They dead? Moses asked simply. All of them. Moses nodded slowly. He was a big man, shoulders broad from decades of field work, hands scarred from cotton bowls and overseer's punishments. Scars crisscrossed his back in layers, a topographical map of brutality. But tonight his face was calm, almost peaceful. Good, he said. That's good. Burke? The overseer. Dead in his bed. Never woke up. Moses's voice held no emotion, just fact. Thaddeus Burke gonna sleep forever now. Seemed fitting, somehow. Around them, the organized destruction continued. The blacksmith shop was burning. The stable had been opened, horses driven out toward the woods where they'd scatter and be gone by morning. The tool shed, the storehouse, the small chapel where visiting preachers had lectured about obedience and Jesus, all of it feeding the flames. But not the cabins. Not the quarters where the enslaved people lived. Those stood untouched, though Josiah knew that wouldn't last. When the white militia came, and they would come, drawn by smoke and rumors and the fundamental threat this represented, they would burn everything. Every structure. Every field. Every reminder that resistance was possible. How many gone north already? Josiah asked. 30, maybe 40, Moses said. Moving in small groups toward the Tombigbee. Figure if we can cross the river, make it to the hill country, we got a chance. Not much of one, but more than we had yesterday. And the rest? Moses's face tightened. Some too scared to run. Some too old. Some. He gestured vaguely at a group of people standing near the well, just watching, their faces showing a mix of terror and confusion and disbelief. Some can't imagine a world different than this one. Been slaves so long they don't know how to be anything else. Josiah understood. He'd felt that way himself once, in the years before Delilah was born, when survival meant making yourself small and invisible and compliant. It took something, love or loss or rage, to break that paralysis. Not everyone had that something. Not everyone wanted it. Harriet appeared at his elbow, breathing hard. Horses are gone. Food stores, what little there was, distributed. I gave the good silver to folks heading north. Maybe they can trade it for passage or help or. She trailed off. They both knew the silver wouldn't help much. Nothing would help much. This was a gesture, not a plan. An eruption, not a strategy. You coming north? Moses asked her. Harriet shook her head. Too old for running. Too tired. I'll take my chances here, whatever comes. She looked at Josiah. You. Josiah turned back toward the plantation house. It still stood, white columns gleaming in the firelight, windows dark. Inside, 9 bodies cooling in the parlor, the evidence of his resistance. His revenge. His desperate, futile act of love for a daughter already lost. I'm going north, he said. Not to escape. To remember. Someone needs to remember what we did here. What we had to do. They'll hunt you special, Moses warned. Killing white folks, especially white folks like that. They'll chase you all the way to Canada if they have to. Let them chase. A shout rose from near the gin, not alarm, but something like dark celebration. A section of the roof had collapsed, sending up a column of sparks that illuminated everything in stark orange light. In that moment, Josiah could see all of them clearly, 50, 60 people who had been property hours ago, now standing in the ruins of their captivity, their faces showing every emotion humans were capable of feeling. Terror, because retribution was coming. Joy, because for this moment, this one night, they were free. Grief, because so many weren't here to see it. Rage, because it had taken this long, cost this much. Hope, fragile and foolish as a candle in a hurricane, but hope nonetheless. We need to move soon, Moses said, looking east where the sky was still black but wouldn't stay that way forever. Dawn comes, someone gonna see this smoke from town. Militia be here by noon, maybe sooner. Then we move now. Josiah looked around at the gathered people. Anyone coming north, gather what you can carry. Food, water, nothing else. We travel fast and quiet through the swamp bottoms. Make for the Tombigbee, cross where the water runs shallow near Devil's Bend. After that. He shrugged. After that we keep moving until we can't anymore. They dispersed to prepare, and Josiah found himself standing alone for a moment, watching the cotton gin burn. He thought about Delilah, somewhere south of here, probably in Mobile by now, sold into whatever fresh hell awaited her there. He wondered if she could see this smoke, if somehow she knew that her father had refused to accept what they did to her, had made them pay in blood and glass and fire. He thought about Cornelius Merricks, dead on his Persian rug, his last moments spent realizing that the furniture had feelings after all. He thought about Judge Calhoun and the widow Thornton and all the others, their refined sensibilities no protection against ground glass mixed with honey and butter and the accumulated rage of generations. Had it been worth it? He didn't know. Wouldn't know. Maybe there was no worth it when you were fighting a machine this big, this entrenched. Maybe all you could do was throw your body against the gears and hope the damage you caused meant something to someone, somewhere, someday. Harriet returned to his side one last time. She pressed something into his hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, he found cornbread and dried meat and a tiny tin flask. For the journey, she said. And Josiah? What you did tonight, what we all did, it matters. Even if they catch us, even if they hang every last one of us, it matters. They'll remember. They'll know we weren't livestock. We were people who fought back. He embraced her briefly, this woman who had been the closest thing to a mother he'd had since his own died. Then Moses whistled from the edge of the firelight, the signal that it was time to move. Josiah joined the group heading north: Moses, Samuel, Ruth, young David who was barely 15, old woman named Miriam who insisted she was strong enough to walk, half a dozen others. They moved in single file through the darkness, away from the burning gin, away from the plantation house where 9 bodies would be discovered come morning, away from everything they'd ever known. Behind them, the flames climbed higher. Ahead, the forest waited, dark and deep and offering no promises. Somewhere in the distance, dogs began to bark. 3 weeks after the Merricks cotton gin revolt, as it would come to be known in whispered histories and newspaper accounts that stripped it of context and humanity, the ruins still smoldered. The cotton gin was a skeleton of charred timber, black bones reaching toward an indifferent sky. The overseer's house had been reduced to foundation stones and ash. The main plantation house stood, but emptied of its grandeur, windows shattered, door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, on a Persian rug stained permanently brown, the shapes of bodies could still be traced in the patterns of dried blood that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. Not that anyone was trying to scrub them away. The Merricks plantation had become a graveyard, a monument to the terrible arithmetic of resistance. The white folks of Wilcox County had descended on it with the militia 3 days after the fire, following smoke and rumors and the fundamental need to restore order through overwhelming violence. What they found in the parlor had sent shock waves through Alabama and beyond. 9 of the county's most prominent citizens, dead from internal injuries consistent with ground glass consumption. Poisoned. Murdered. By their own servants. The retribution had been biblical. They caught Moses and his group at the Tombigbee River, the water running too high from recent rains to cross safely. The trial lasted less than an hour. The executions took place in the town square in Camden, public and prolonged, designed to serve as education. Moses died last, and they said he sang a hymn until his voice gave out. Ruth, Samuel, young David, old Miriam, all hanged. They caught others in the woods, in neighboring plantations where sympathetic hands had offered shelter. Each capture led to more arrests, more accusations, more bodies swinging from oak trees that had witnessed too much death already and would witness more still. Harriet they found in her cabin, sitting in her rocking chair as if waiting for them. She went to the gallows with her head high, refusing the hood they offered. Her last words were reported in the Camden Journal, though the editor included them only to demonstrate the depth of depravity that slavery sometimes produced in the simple-minded. We were people. Remember that. We were people. 37 enslaved people were executed in the aftermath. Dozens more were sold south as a precautionary measure, scattered across the deep south to prevent any remaining seeds of rebellion from taking root. But they never found Josiah. His body wasn't at the Tombigbee with the others. Wasn't discovered in the swamps. Wasn't turned in by any of the neighboring plantations or any of the bounty hunters who scoured the countryside for months afterward. The butler who had orchestrated the poisoning, who had ground glass into powder and served it with honey and butter, who had looked his master in the eye as the man died, that man simply vanished. Some said he made it north, following the drinking gourd to freedom in Ohio or Canada. Others claimed he drowned in the Tombigbee, his body carried downstream to the Mobile Bay and the Gulf beyond. Still others whispered darker possibilities, that he'd been torn apart by dogs in some forgotten hollow, that he'd died of fever in the swamps, that he'd been caught and killed quietly, without record, to prevent him from becoming a martyr. But there were other stories too. Stranger ones. The new overseer brought in to manage what remained of the Merricks estate. The land had been sold to a cotton speculator from Mobile, the enslaved population replenished with fresh purchases from the auctions. That overseer quit after 2 weeks. He told anyone who would listen that he'd seen something in the ruins of the gin at midnight. A figure in a butler's coat, standing among the charred timbers, bent over something on the ground. Grinding, the overseer said, his hands shaking as he accepted whiskey at the tavern in Camden. Making that sound, stone on stone, scraping and grinding. I called out, asked who was there. And he looked up at me. The overseer had drained his glass in one swallow. His eyes. Lord help me, his eyes were empty. Not angry, not sad, just empty. Like he'd seen something that had hollowed him out from the inside. Then he went back to his grinding, and when I got my nerve up to move closer, there wasn't nobody there. Just ashes and moonlight and that sound, still echoing. The overseer's replacement lasted 3 days before he too abandoned his post, claiming similar visions. After that, they stopped trying to man the plantation at all. Travelers on the road to Camden reported strange occurrences near the old Merricks place. Lights in the abandoned house after dark. The smell of cooking food drifting from a kitchen that no longer had a roof. The sound of crystal glasses clinking together in toast, followed by screaming that cut off abruptly, leaving only cicadas and silence. A Methodist circuit rider passing through in the autumn claimed he'd seen a full dinner party through the windows of the main house, ladies in silk gowns, gentlemen in formal coats, servants moving between them with trays and decanters. He'd stopped to investigate, thinking perhaps the estate had been resold and reoccupied. But when he approached the house, he found it as empty and ruined as ever, windows dark, door hanging open to reveal nothing but dust and bloodstains and the remnants of grandeur. But I heard them, he insisted to his congregation the following Sunday. Clear as I hear you now. Laughter and conversation and then, all at once, choking. Terrible sounds of people dying in agony. And underneath it all, a voice, one voice, calm and steady, saying the same words over and over, we were people. Remember that. We were people. By winter, the stories had calcified into legend. The Merricks plantation became a place avoided after dark, a cautionary tale told to children and newcomers. Don't go near the old gin. Don't linger on that stretch of road after sunset. Don't look too closely at the ruins, because sometimes the ruins look back. The war came 5 years later, and Alabama burned in ways that made one plantation fire seem quaint by comparison. Sherman's march, Union occupation, the violent collapse of the Confederacy and everything it represented. In the chaos, stories like the Merricks Revolt were forgotten or deliberately buried, too dangerous, too incendiary, too much evidence that the enslaved had been capable of organized resistance all along. The historical record grew sparse. A few newspaper articles. Some trial transcripts. A letter from a plantation owner to his brother in Montgomery, describing the horror of what had been done and the necessity of swift retaliation. These documents survived in archives and historical societies, filed under slave rebellions, minor, or criminal cases, 1857, or simply forgotten in boxes that no one bothered to open. But the stories persisted in other ways. Oral histories passed down through families who had survived, who had witnessed, who remembered. Fragments preserved in journals and letters and whispered warnings. The tale of Josiah the butler, who had ground glass into powder and served it to his masters, became part of the complicated, painful mythology of resistance. Not celebrated, exactly, but not forgotten either. Some nights, even now, more than a century and a half later, locals claim to hear grinding sounds coming from the old Merricks property. The land has changed hands a dozen times, been subdivided and developed and stripped of its historical markers. A gas station occupies part of what used to be the cotton fields. A Dollar General sits approximately where the main house once stood. But the locals remember, in that way that places remember trauma, not in monuments or plaques, but in an unease that settles over the land at certain hours, in the feeling that you're being watched when you pass through at dusk, in the stories that parents tell children about why you don't linger in certain parking lots after dark. And sometimes, they say, if you're quiet enough, if you listen with the right kind of attention, you can still hear it, stone on stone, grinding something fine and sharp and patient. The sound of resistance being prepared, grain by grain, in the darkness where all desperate acts are born. Whether Josiah died in those weeks after the revolt or made it to freedom, no one knows for certain. The historical record is silent on his fate, which is perhaps its own kind of answer, that he became what he'd spent most of his life being, invisible, unrecorded, one more person whose story was deemed unworthy of official documentation. But in the silence, in the gaps of what was written down, other truths survive. In a church basement in Ohio, there's a journal allegedly written by a formerly enslaved man who arrived via the Underground Railroad in late 1857. The handwriting is crude but legible, the story fragmentary but consistent. He describes a butler named Josiah who appeared at a safe house near the Ohio River, more ghost than man, who stayed for 3 days without speaking and then moved on, north toward Canada. He never said what he'd done, the journal entry reads. But his hands shook when he held a glass, and he wouldn't eat nothing that someone else prepared. And when he finally spoke, all he said was, "I had a daughter. Her name was Delilah. Remember her. Remember all of them." In a cemetery outside Toronto, there's a grave marker from 1889. The name has weathered almost to illegibility, but local records identify the deceased as Josiah Freeman, a common enough assumed name for the formerly enslaved. The man was buried with full honors by the local African Methodist Episcopal Church, identified in their records as a veteran of the freedom struggle, a man who paid the full price for resistance. Is it the same Josiah? No way to know. The dates align. The geography is plausible. But certainty is a luxury that history rarely provides, especially for people who lived and died in the margins. What is certain is this: on the evening of August 14, 1857, in Wilcox County, Alabama, 9 white people died agonizing deaths from ground glass poisoning at a plantation dinner party. In the chaos that followed, a cotton gin burned, enslaved people fled, and the machinery of slavery responded with the only language it knew: overwhelming, spectacular violence designed to terrify and control. 37 people were executed. Dozens more were sold away. The resistance was crushed, as resistance so often was, under the weight of superior force and legal apparatus that existed solely to maintain the status quo. But the resistance happened. That matters. For one night, the architecture of dehumanization cracked. For one night, the people who had been reduced to property reclaimed their humanity through the only means available to them. For one night, the masters learned what their servants had always known, that cruelty breeds cruelty, that oppression generates resistance, that human beings will fight back against their chains even when fighting back means death. The Merricks plantation is gone now, paved over and parceled out and turned into the mundane geography of strip malls and gas stations. But the story persists in fragments and whispers, in academic papers about slave rebellions and oral histories preserved by descendants, in the occasional journalist who stumbles across the trial transcripts and wonders about the fuller story that was never recorded. And on certain nights, when the wind comes from the right direction and the air grows thick with the particular heaviness of Alabama summer, people passing through that stretch of county still report hearing it. The sound of stone on stone. The patient, methodical grinding of something being prepared. A reminder that resistance is never truly crushed, only buried. And that the ground, if you listen closely enough, is full of ghosts who refuse to be forgotten. Josiah's hands, somewhere in the darkness, keep grinding. The glass waits. And history, which tried so hard to erase this story, finds itself haunted by the very people it attempted to silence. Remember them. Remember Josiah, who had a daughter named Delilah and refused to accept her loss quietly. Remember Moses and Harriet and Ruth and Samuel and all 37 who died for daring to claim their humanity. Remember the Merricks cotton gin revolt, not as tragedy or triumph, but as testimony. As evidence. As truth, however uncomfortable, however dark, however necessary. The glass supper happened. The glass supper matters. And the grinding sound you hear in the darkness? That's the sound of history refusing to stay buried. Thank you for experiencing this haunting chapter of American history with us. Subscribe for more macabre tales that history tried to bury, and comment below with your thoughts on this forgotten revolt.